You don't have to keep learning as a leader. You can decide that you know enough. But what you'll find in just a few years is that you know an awful lot about a world that doesn't exist anymore. Hey leader, David Burkus here, organizational psychologist and author of 4 best-selling books on helping leaders and teams do their best work ever. And in this episode, we're gonna talk about how to keep learning as a leader. Leaders are learners. That's not really disputed, right? You have to be a pretty strong learner to even get into a leadership role. And most people agree that you have to be continuously learning as a leader as well. The problem is that what's common knowledge is not always common practice. But what leaders who consistently excel know, leaders who do their best work ever and lead their best teams ever, what those leaders know is that continuously learning has to be a priority. It has to be something they see as just as important as all of those other things. So in this episode, we're gonna talk about 4 ways you can keep learning as a leader. And as we do, remember that these are not optional, these are not some days, these are not tomorrows, these are today techniques you can use to keep learning as a leader. Let's get started. The first way to keep learning as a leader is to linger on failure. I know I'm going right with the uncomfortable one, right? Because we don't like failure. We don't like to admit that we failed. We don't like it when things go awry. But the truth is, failure is inevitable. Moreover, smart leaders know that failure is feedback. Even the failure of having your shirt kind of crooked as you're filming this. Failure is feedback. There are lessons to be drawn out of failure. And smart leaders know that they need to draw those out for themselves and their teams as well. In fact, it's one of the easiest ways to keep learning as a leader is to analyze what went wrong and why and what you can learn from it. You know, when I think about learning from failure, I think about the Marine Corps veteran and leadership expert Jocko Willink. Jocko's known for his extreme ownership ideas and also for working out at 4:30 every single morning. What a lot of people don't appreciate is that extreme ownership concept came from a very real failure in a team that Jocko led. A team that was charged with a mission that went awry and ended up with there being friendly fire accidents. Literally people from different sides of the armed services thinking each other was the enemy and firing on each other. And it was in the after-action review, it was in pulling lessons from the failure that Jocko learned the biggest lesson, the one that he's been teaching now for more than a decade, which is that he needed to take ownership of that failure or else he was never going to learn. He needed to take ownership of that failure or else his team would not progress. That's what I mean when I say learn from failure. Don't try and shift the blame to someone else. Pull the lessons from it and you'll find you keep learning. The second way to keep learning as a leader is to stay curious. Be willing to challenge the status quo. Be willing to ask questions. Be willing to ask people to explain things to you like you're 5 years old. It's not just a Michael Scott meme. It's a real practical tactic. And you know, as leaders, we often do the opposite of this. We like to know that we have the answers, or at least pretend that we have the answers. There's a real benefit that happens from being willing to admit we don't know and being relentlessly curious about the things that we don't know, but only if we're willing to embrace it. You know, I think about staying curious and I think about the Hollywood producer Brian Grazer. Brian and the company he founded, Imagine Entertainment, is known for big blockbusters on screen like Apollo 13 and small screen television shows that ran successfully for multiple seasons like 24. And one of the things that Brian engaged in from early on in his career, it's probably the reason his career has been so fantastic, is what he called curiosity conversations. Anytime he was interested about an industry, a subject matter, or just a person, he would invite them to have a conversation. Not because he was trying to sell them on something, etc., but just because he wanted to learn. He made it a regular practice to have at least one of these every single week. One curiosity conversation that would teach him about something he didn't know before. There's 2 things to pull for this. One, having those curiosity conversations is important, but also you have to be humble enough to be willing to admit that you don't know enough to ask someone to have that conversation with you. And that humility and curiosity is what causes all of that learning as a leader. So maybe you don't do the curiosity conversations, but get that humility, couple it with curiosity, and keep learning. The third way to keep learning as a leader, experiment. Be willing to try new things. Be willing to do things differently, even when what you're doing is working. Even when the way we've always done it before is actually still effective. Be willing to continuously challenge and try and find ways to be more effective. So experiment. experiment. Be willing to let your team experiment. Fight for the ability to experiment, even if it means increases in failures, because as we learned right off the bat, failures produce learning. But also, treat more things like experiments. Treat decisions like experiments. You know, when I think about this, I think about one of the best pieces of advice that I learned from Peter Drucker. And I learned it, by the way, by reading. I wish I could have had a curiosity conversation with Peter Drucker, but I didn't even really know how important he was until he was already sort of unreachable. But one of the things I learned from Peter Drucker was a piece of advice he gave in The Effective Executive, which was to keep a decision journal. Anytime you have to make a decision as a leader, as a manager, write down the date, write down what that decision was, and write down the expected outcome from that decision. You see, just keeping that journal turns decisions into experimentation, because you have the ability to go back 3 months, 6 months, a year later and say, you know, I made this decision on this day and I thought it was going to produce this. Did it? And if not, what lessons can I learn from it? I think a lot of people don't think of decisions as experimentations, but if you do, you'll find you are experimenting a whole lot more, and hence you're learning a whole lot more. And the last way to keep learning as a leader is to cultivate conflict. Be okay with conflict when your people speak up and push against your ideas. Not only be okay with it, actively seek out people who are willing to push back on that. You know, we think mistakenly that cohesiveness, that everybody being in agreement is a sign that we know enough about a topic and we've made a right decision. But the truth is, in many, many cases, when no one on a team is in conflict, it means one of two things. It either means there's so much groupthink that we're obviously missing something and we're headed for disaster. Or it means that there's not enough safety on our team where people feel free to speak up with the disagreements and the different perspectives that they have, and we're headed for disaster. It's not actually a good thing when a team is in consensus. There's a difference, by the way, between consensus and commitment. You want your team to be committed to a certain course of action, but you only get true commitment when you allow everybody to be heard. So seek out those differences of opinion, those differences of ideas. You know, I'm reminded of the famous and possibly apocryphal story of Alfred P. Sloan, the famous executive of General Motors. There's this story about him at a senior leadership meeting talking about a major decision that had to be made. And he says, you know, gentlemen, unfortunately it was all gentlemen at the time. Actually, unfortunately, it's still mostly gentlemen at the time, but that could be a whole other video. Alfred P. Sloan says, gentlemen, I think we're all in agreement about what needs to be done here. And as everyone starts nodding, Sloan says, then I propose we postpone this meeting and we re-adjourn when one or two of you has a reason why this decision will not work. See, what Sloan knew is that in order to keep learning, in order to make the best decision, he had to cultivate conflict. He had to push people to be able to disagree with him so he could know that he had looked at the issue from all possible angles and was making the best informed decision. You can't keep learning without conflict. So cultivate conflict and you will continuously be making better decisions. Now, I should say right off the bat that none of these 4 tactics are comfortable. You may have watched one and you thought, oh, I'm going to try that one. And then immediately in your mind, you think, oh, but that means I have to do this and that means it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable talking about failure. It's uncomfortable being humble and also curious, being willing to admit you don't know things so that you can learn more. It's uncomfortable cultivating conflict. It's uncomfortable treating your decisions as experiments because you might think you're going to second guess them. But no true learning happens inside your comfort zone. The only place that growth is possible is outside that comfort zone. And so if you want to stay committed to keep learning as a leader, you're unfortunately going to have to stay committed to being uncomfortable as a leader as well. And that's okay. Discomfort is a sign that you're growing. It's a sign that you're learning. It's a sign that you are leading your team in new and better ways and creating an environment where everyone can do their best work ever. And by the way, as you are learning and growing as a leader, you're probably going to want to create a culture of learning on your team. In fact, you're probably going to want to make improvements to your whole team culture. So you're going to want to watch this video on what makes for a strong team culture. This one, the one right here. Click it, watch it, learn.